Hello and welcome to the Love Vibe podcast, hosted by Angela and Key, two women from the African diaspora creating space to explore and celebrate the sometimes unheard voices, stories and storytellers that speak to triumph and healing in the face of adversity and trauma. We will look at our connections to ourselves, to others, the environment, ancestry and the stars, yes, astrology. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We welcome you to join us. Now, let's start the show. Hello and welcome back to the Love Vibe. Hi, I'm Angela, and this is actually one of my first solo podcast offerings, which in this season we're going to be doing. So a combination of solo and together with my co-host Key. And today I'm going to be talking to you about adult life story work. As many of you know who listen to this podcast, I've been a social worker for 27 years and just wanted to share with you the values of life story work for adults. And this is what we're going to be talking about in this podcast today. Before we get to it though, if you would like, and we would love you to like, subscribe, share this podcast with friends and family who you think might be interested. That would be really helpful. So down below. Thank you. So today we're going to be talking about life story work for adults. We're going to go through the value of understanding our stories, what actually is life story work, why could it be important for you, what does it involve? And I'd really love to have some comments about whether this is, just about your thoughts about it, really. So let's kick off. And I would say that I do have notes. So if you see me looking to the side, it's because I'm looking at my notes. So I'll start at the beginning. What is life story work? And why is it important for us? As many of you know who listen to this podcast, we talk a lot about the power and the importance of our stories and also about our histories, including ancestry. Life story work for adults is a system and an intervention that can actually help us to begin to make sense of what's happened for us and what's happened to us. So it helps us to make sense of ourselves, to ourselves, if that makes sense. It's about joining the dots of events in our lives which seemingly seem to be stranded out there in our own universes, but are actually connected to our story and our identity. We're all busy doing life, relationships, parenting, careers, goal setting, goal making, friendships, and understanding ourselves. And it's all the things that we do. And we sometimes can become quite busy with that because that's what we're told we're meant to be doing as adults, adulting, isn't it? But actually, sometimes we can actually have unconscious things running in the background, and they can be tied to traumatic events. They can be tied to periods in our life, particularly our early childhoods. And sometimes when they're unresolved, they can be a background operating system. We all know this. And some of those some of those unconscious things, when left unattended to, can actually begin to start tugging at our current lives. And I'm sure many of us have felt that. And I suppose I'm here to say that those things are tugging not because they want to ruin our lives. They're just saying we're still here and we need your attention. We need for you to integrate us so that we can be dismissed and you can go on with your life in full knowledge of what you've experienced and integrating it. No one wants to be in the past, living in the future, but constantly being taken back to the past by those events. And life story work is a really great way to be able to make sense and to integrate. So, yeah, let's get to it. What is it? Life story work is actually a social work intervention. And it was started to be used probably in around the 1980s to help kids who'd suffered trauma, neglect, abandonment, and who were actually in the care system. And this was a system that was derived to help kids to understand the chronology of events, but also to create a space where they could recall memories, be in touch with anecdotal information about their lives, and also to help to answer questions about what had happened to them, what was the context. So it meant that kids could go on and face their lives with an understanding and a script, and they could join the dots. And ultimately, they could have a sense of belonging, that they could have a sense of integration. And as I said, belonging. And the interesting thing about life stories is that it's uniquely human. It's one of the unique things that we can do as human beings. There might be a few more considerations for people who experience learning issues, but this system can be used, or this intervention can be used to be able to help us to make sense and to join the dots. So that's life story work. So now we'll go on to why might it be important for us as adults to understand our life stories? Why might it be important for us? And as I said, life story work can help us to make sense of us in context. It can help us to understand, why do we choose to tell the stories that we tell about ourselves? And to have a space to be able to look at, are those stories told with some kind of triumph or hope or courageousness? Or are they told with a deprecating tinge, or a tinge of look at what terrible things have happened to me? And that might be true, that terrible things have happened to you. And so it helps us to view how we're telling our story. We also get a chance to look at the meaning of those significant events and the significance of what those events meant to us. Two seemingly similar people may experience the same similar events, but the meaning that attached to those events might actually be quite different. And sometimes that can be to do with people's personalities, people's identities, but also, did those people have any type of assistance to help them to integrate those experiences. It is a different experience when you encounter trauma or traumatic events and you feel as if you're carrying them by yourself. And so sometimes family, community, friends can help you, unbeknownst to them, to help you to integrate the pain that you may feel. And so sometimes these things can be quite important in understanding your story. Our life stories actually become part and parcel of our personalities and identities. So the point of view, the voice that is attached, the tone of the voice that is attached to your story is important because it can help to create how you see yourself and your personality and character in the world. Having suffered abuse and trauma or being abandoned is obviously going to color your point of view. And that, if you were to understand that your tone of voice for your life story is because of these experiences, it might actually be easier to accept what has happened and to accept where you find yourself here now today. And I'll take a minute to actually talk about triggers, how triggers can also play a part in taking us back to those events. And triggers sometimes can be more about a life and death response. We see this a lot in kids who suffer trauma. It feels like it's a life and death response. So the response or the trigger to something can appear on the outside to be disproportionate, but actually it can have its roots much, much, much earlier on in that person's past. And so it is important to have that space where you're able to go, what was that trigger really about? And it may not have anything to do with the thing that you're facing in the current moment. It may actually have hallmarks and similarities to something that you may have already experienced. And actually what you're doing is you're enacting that life and death response because you don't want to experience that thing again. And so you do, in your adult way, you use those tools to be able to go, I'm not going to experience that again. And so the response looks like way out of proportion. But the life story workspace can actually enable you to have a system of being able to track back. It's like being a life detective, your own life detective, where you're able to go back to the crumbs and go, oh, I can see the similarity in this event has triggered this old thing, which has been tugging at me, which is asking to be dealt with, integrated, and to be dismissed so that you can go on with your life. Yeah, and we talked about integration and about how that's really important. And in that life story space, you're able to actually assess that in a way that's meaningful to you. You get time to join the dots, to understand the story that you believe about yourself, and to see where do these things show up in your life. Okay, so what does life story work for adults involve? As I said at the very beginning, it can involve creating a timeline. And timelines come in lots of different shapes and forms. But it is important to set out a timeline to understand what are those memories, where do those memories come from, and the associated feelings.
And when you're able to see the timeline and look at the different ages that things happen, you're able to kind of also track it against developmental milestones. And that's really important because obviously when we're born, we have a brain, but the brain of, when you're born to an adult, it takes time to grow. It takes time to develop different parts of the brain. And the developing brain, particularly between, birth and 5, is it's where the brain does its most leaps and bounds. And so it can be influenced a lot by external events. And trauma, I mean, there's lots of neuroscience around trauma in the growing brain, and how certain significant trauma can actually impact different parts of the brain. And particularly in social work, it is well known that early childhood trauma can impact the seats where in the brain where that relate to regulation. So being able to regulate your emotions. We talked about triggers. We talked about maybe having meltdowns. That early childhood traumas can actually impact those parts of the brain. It can also impact concentration. So, our ability to focus on things, and also, lots of different areas. So the developmental timelines are really important because they're the times when your brain was growing. Your brain was understanding not only the world and whether it was a safe place or not, and the people around were safe or not, but neuroscience tells us that these things, when left unattended and unchecked, can actually have significant impacts. And it doesn't mean that the brain doesn't have elasticity, and that's the ability to be able to make changes. It can, but it sometimes requires knowledge, and it requires knowledge of the people around you. Particularly as a kid, it means that your caregivers, your parents or the people that are bringing you up, need to be able to understand it to assist you. And I suppose that's the piece where we talked about integration. Were there people around that helped, you as a kid to integrate difficult, challenging, traumatic events? And so the neuroscience even kind of backs that up, really, around brain plasticity. So that's really the gist of life story work. Its importance for us as adults, what it involves, and where its roots come from. And so, that's my first solo podcast for The Love Vibe. If you have liked this podcast and you have any questions, I'd really like to hear your comments in the comment section. Please, as always, please like, please subscribe, please comment. We really would like your feedback. And that's me. All right. Okay. Thank you.